I was 1 week out of an emergency cesarean section, barely able to stand without holding the wall, when my own father walked into my home with a man he called a doctor and told me I was too unwell to be trusted with my own baby. The man set a leather bag on my kitchen table, drew a syringe from it, and said in a flat, calm voice that it would help me relax while we discussed what was best for the child. My daughter was asleep in my arms, all 7 pounds and 2 ounces of her, and my father reached out to take her from me. And then what happened next was absolutely unbelievable. Before I get into the story, you all know how much I love seeing where you are watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. But today, I want to ask you something that cuts a little deeper. Have you ever had your own mind, your own sanity, turned into a weapon against you by the people who were supposed to love you most? Or do you still believe that family will always protect the weakest person in the room? Drop your location, your local time, and a simple yes or no in the comments right now. I read every one of them. My name is Nora, and for 34 years I believed that if I was calm enough and competent enough, no one would ever be able to call me crazy. I grew up in the old money silence of Lewisburg Square in Boston, Massachusetts, in a family where feelings were considered a kind of vulgar weakness, and where the worst thing you could possibly be was an embarrassment. My father, Lawrence Ashford, ran the family the way he ran his money, with cold control and careful records, and he taught me before I was 10 years old that a person's worth was measured by their usefulness and their composure, never by their heart. I learned to keep my face still. I learned to never let anyone see me cry, and I learned, far too well, that in my family a loss of control was the one sin that could never be forgiven. So I built a life out of being unshakable. I became a consultant in healthcare law, the kind of person hospitals and courts call in when they need someone to untangle a question of medical capacity, a disputed diagnosis, a fight over whether a patient is competent to make their own decisions. I spent my days reading psychiatric evaluations and guardianship petitions and the fine print of what it actually takes under the law to declare a grown adult unfit to run their own life. I had sat in courtrooms and watched a greedy relative try to have an aging parent declared incompetent so they could seize the estate, and I had been the one who stopped them. I had learned to spot a fabricated diagnosis at a glance, to know the difference between a real evaluation and a paid opinion dressed up in clinical language. I was very good at it. I knew exactly how the system could be used to protect a vulnerable person, and I knew, far better than most, exactly how it could be twisted to cage one. I never once imagined that my own family would try to use that machinery against me. I had spent my whole career watching wealthy families do this to strangers. It never occurred to me that I was a stranger to my own father. Then I met Caleb, and for the first time in my life, I felt safe being a whole person. Caleb is a pediatric nurse, a man who spends his nights soothing sick children and frightened parents, who measures his worth by the small lives he steadies and not by anything he owns. When we married, my family treated it as a quiet humiliation. My mother, Constance, told her friends that I had chosen to play house with an orderly, as if a man who saves children were something to be ashamed of. But Caleb gave me the one thing my family never had, which was a home where I was allowed to simply be myself, tired and human and real. For 3 years, we lived in a small, bright house with a garden Caleb planted, and I let myself believe I had finally escaped the cold rules I was raised under. To understand why my family came for my baby, you have to understand the Ashford Trust. My late grandfather had built a fortune worth $18 million, and like so many men of his kind, he did not trust a single one of his living descendants to be wise with it. So he locked the heart of it inside a trust, and he wrote one strange and old-fashioned condition into the structure. The controlling shares and the income of that trust would pass to the first grandchild of the next generation, but because that grandchild would, of course, be a minor, the trust named the child's legal guardian as the administrator of those shares until the child came of age. Whoever held lawful custody of the heir would, for nearly 2 decades, control $18 million and the votes that came with it. My grandfather thought he was protecting a child. What he had actually done was paint a target on the back of whichever baby was born first. For years that did not matter, because no grandchild existed. My brother Spencer and his wife Camilla had no children and showed no sign of wanting the trouble of them. And my parents treated me as the family's reliable, unmarried, unimportant problem solver, the daughter who fixed things and asked for nothing. Then I married Caleb, and then I became pregnant, and the cold arithmetic of that trust slid quietly into place behind my family's eyes. My child would be the first grandchild. My child would be the heir. And I, the mother, the natural legal guardian, would hold those $18 million and that voting power in my hands for the next 18 years. My family could not stand that, not because they hated me exactly, but because in their minds I had married badly. I had stepped outside their control, and I could not be trusted to manage the fortune the way they wanted. Spencer and Camilla wanted to raise the heir themselves in the right house, with the right name, with the money flowing through their hands. And so, somewhere in the months of my pregnancy, my father made a decision. If he could not trust the mother, he would simply remove her. He would have me declared mentally unfit, seize guardianship of my newborn for Spencer, and through that guardianship, take control of the trust. The most monstrous part is that he convinced himself it was reasonable. In my father's mind, a woman who had married an orderly and refused the family's guidance was already proof of poor judgment. He only needed a doctor willing to put that opinion on paper. He found one. His name was Dr. Marcus Ellison, a man who had once been a respected psychiatrist and who now did quiet, expensive favors for quiet, expensive families. My father did not know or did not care that Ellison's medical license had been suspended the previous year after a board investigation. All my father cared about was that Ellison would sign whatever was needed. My daughter's birth was frightening. My blood pressure crashed in the final hour. Her heartbeat slowed, and the doctors at Boston General rushed me into an emergency cesarean section. When I woke, shaking and sore, the long line of staples across my belly burning with every breath, the nurse laid my daughter against my chest, and the fear melted away. We named her Maeve. For 1 week, Caleb and I lived inside a small, exhausted bubble of love, learning her tiny face, and I let myself forget, just for a little while, the cold house I came from. The bubble broke on a Tuesday evening, just after 9, when Caleb had gone to cover a night shift at the children's hospital. I was alone, moving slowly through the kitchen with Maeve asleep against my shoulder, when I heard a key in my front door. The only people who had ever been given a key were my parents, in case of emergency, a courtesy I had offered years ago and never thought about again. The door opened and my father walked in, followed by my mother, Constance, then my brother, Spencer, and last of all, a heavy-set older man carrying a leather medical bag. The room seemed to close in around me. "Father," I said, "what are you doing here? It is 9 at night." My father did not answer the question. He told me, in the same level voice he had used my whole childhood, that the family was concerned. He said that I had not been myself since the birth, that I seemed agitated and unstable, that a new mother in my fragile state could be a danger to a helpless infant. He gestured to the man with the bag and introduced him as Dr. Ellison, who had come, he said, to make a simple assessment for everyone's peace of mind. My mother would not look at me. Spencer stood by the wall with his arms crossed, already wearing the face of a man preparing to be a father. I knew, in that instant, exactly what this was. I had read 100 files just like it. I told them, as calmly as I could with my heart hammering, that I was perfectly well, that they needed to leave, and that no assessment was happening in my home at 9 at night without my consent. And that is when Dr. Ellison opened his bag, drew out a syringe, and said, in a voice meant to sound soothing, that I seemed quite agitated and that a mild sedative would help me settle so we could talk reasonably. He took a step toward me. My father stepped forward at the same moment and reached out to take Maeve from my arms, saying that the baby should not be held by someone in my condition. Something inside me turned to ice. I twisted my body away from my father's hands, shielding Maeve with my whole self, and the sudden motion tore at my incision so hard that the room went white at the edges, and I cried out. I stumbled back against the counter. Maeve woke and began to scream. Dr. Ellison advanced with the syringe. My father pressed in with his hands out for the baby, and for one terrible moment I truly believed they were going to drug me and carry my week-old daughter out my own front door. What saved me was the smallest thing. My phone was on the counter beside me, and in my years of doing the work I do, I had a reflex so deep it had become instinct. The instant the door opened, before I even understood why, I had pressed record. The whole scene was captured. Every word my father said about my fragile state, Ellison's voice offering a sedative to a woman who had only asked them to leave, the sound of my cry and my daughter's screaming. It was all there. And the second thing that saved me was Caleb. His shift had been canceled at the last minute, and his car was pulling into the driveway just as the noise reached its height. He came through the door, took in the syringe, and his father-in-law reaching for his daughter and his wife bleeding and crying against the counter, and he became a wall. He put himself between me and all of them, took Maeve gently into his own arms, and told them in a voice I had never heard from my gentle husband that if Dr. Ellison did not put that needle away, and if they did not all leave his home in the next 10 seconds, he would call the police and a great many of his colleagues at the hospital, and he would tell every one of them exactly what an unlicensed sedation of a post-surgical patient looked like. The word unlicensed landed on Dr. Ellison's face like a slap. My father, sensing the moment slipping, gathered them up with cold fury, and they left. But at the door he turned and told me, very quietly, that I was making this far harder than it needed to be, and that the court would see what the family saw, and that I would lose my daughter cleanly if I kept fighting. That night, after the bleeding was checked and Maeve was asleep and the house was finally quiet, I did not fall apart. I had spent my whole life being told that falling apart was the unforgivable sin, and for once that cruel training served me. A cold, clean clarity settled over me. The clarity of a person who has just realized that the very system she has spent her career mastering is now the only thing standing between her and the loss of her child. The frightened daughter, who had spent 34 years trying to be unshakable for her father's approval, was gone. In her place was the one thing my family had never bothered to fear, which was a woman who knew the machinery of the law better than the people trying to use it against her. The next morning, I called my old mentor, a fierce veteran of guardianship and competency law named Harriet Vance, who had trained me when I first started and who had no patience at all for families who weaponized the courts. I played her the recording. When it finished, she was silent for a long moment, and then she said the words that turned my dread into a plan. She said, "Nora, they did not just frighten you. They built your case for you. For the next 3 weeks, while I healed and held my daughter and let my family believe I was a terrified woman waiting to be crushed, Harriet and I quietly assembled everything we would need. We did 3 things, and we did them carefully. First, I requested on my own initiative a full independent forensic psychiatric evaluation from Dr. Anjali Patel, a respected examiner with no connection to my family at all. I sat through hours of testing and interviews with nothing to hide, and her report came back exactly as I knew it would, describing a competent, stable, perfectly fit mother with no sign of any disorder whatsoever. By asking for the evaluation myself, before my family could control one, I had taken their entire weapon and turned it in my own hand. Second, we investigated Dr. Marcus Ellison. It did not take long. His license had been suspended the previous year and had never been reinstated, which meant that the man who had walked into my home with a syringe was not legally a practicing physician at all, and that any assessment he signed was worthless, and any sedative he administered would have been a crime. Worse for my father, we obtained a copy of the very document my family intended to use, a so-called clinical assessment Ellison had drafted, describing me as suffering from severe postpartum instability and recommending the immediate transfer of custody. He had written it before he ever set foot in my house. The report was dated the day before they came. It was, in plain terms, a fabricated medical document, signed by a man with no license, prepared to strip a mother of her child for the sake of a trust. Third, Harriet and I traced the motive, because motive is what turns a foolish act into a damning one. We documented the structure of the Ashford Trust, the way guardianship of the heir controlled $18 million, and we gathered the family's own communications, the careful planning, the involvement of Spencer and Camilla, who stood to gain custody, the timing of the ambush 1 week after my surgery when I was at my weakest. By the time we were finished, the picture was complete. This was not a worried family seeking help for a struggling mother. This was a coordinated attempt to commit fraud and to kidnap an infant for money. I will not pretend those 3 weeks were easy. There were nights when I lay awake with Maeve on my chest, listening to her breathe, gripped by a fear so old and so deep that it felt like my father was already in the room. I had been raised to believe that he was always right and that I was always one mistake away from being an embarrassment, and that voice did not vanish just because I had grown up. What steadied me was the work. Every time the fear rose, I went back to the files, to the recording, to Dr. Patel's report, and I reminded myself that this time I was not a frightened daughter at all. I was the expert. I had spent 15 years protecting strangers from exactly this, and now, for the first time, I was going to protect my own child with everything I knew. Slowly, the fear cooled into something hard and quiet and useful, and I stopped waiting for my father's verdict on whether I was good enough. I already knew the answer. My family, meanwhile, did exactly what I expected. Believing I was broken and isolated, my father filed a petition in family court seeking emergency guardianship of Maeve, citing my supposed mental unfitness and attaching Dr. Ellison's report as their central evidence. A hearing was set. My father hired an expensive firm and prepared to present a sad story about a fragile daughter and a concerned family. He was so certain of my weakness that he never once imagined I might be ready for him. He had spent my whole life believing I would crumble under pressure. He had never understood that the work I had chosen was nothing but pressure, and that I had spent 15 years learning to stand inside it without breaking. The hearing was held in a quiet, wood-paneled courtroom on a gray morning. My father sat at his table with his lawyers, calm and certain, my mother and Spencer behind him. Caleb sat beside me, holding my hand. My father's attorney rose first and told the court a careful, sorrowful story about a new mother in crisis and a family with no choice but to protect a defenseless child, and he submitted Dr. Ellison's clinical assessment as the heart of their case. My father allowed himself the smallest satisfied nod. He believed it was already over. Then it was our turn, and Harriet rose, and one piece at a time, she took my father's world apart. She submitted Dr. Patel's independent evaluation, the genuine one, describing me as entirely fit, and she invited the court to compare it with the document my family had brought. Then she asked the court to consider the credentials of the man who had written my family's report, and she entered into evidence the official record showing that Dr. Marcus Ellison's license had been suspended a full year earlier and had never been restored. A murmur went through the room. My father's certainty began to crack, and then Harriet entered the assessment's own date, proving that Ellison had written his diagnosis of me the day before he had ever seen me, a diagnosis prepared to order for a patient he had not yet met. And then, with the judge leaning forward, Harriet played the recording. My father's voice filled that courtroom, telling me how fragile and unstable I was. Ellison's voice offered a sedative to a woman who had only asked them to leave her home. My daughter's screams echoed off the wood-paneled walls. When it ended, the silence was absolute. My father had gone the color of ash. Spencer was staring at the table. Dr. Ellison, who had been brought to testify, was already whispering urgently to a lawyer of his own. Harriet was not finished. She laid out the trust, the $18 million, the way guardianship of my daughter would have handed my family control of that fortune, and she asked the court the only question that mattered, which was whether this looked like a family protecting a child or a family stealing one. Then she did the thing my father never saw coming. She filed on my behalf a petition of our own, asking the court not only to dismiss my father's claim, but to grant a protective order against him, against my brother, and against the man with the false license, and to confirm me as the sole and undisputed guardian of my daughter. The judge granted all of it. My father's petition was thrown out as the fraud it was. A protective order was issued, and the court referred the entire matter, the forged document, the unlicensed practitioner, the attempted seizure, to the proper authorities, because filing a fabricated medical assessment in a court of law is a crime, and so is conspiring to remove a child for financial gain. The fallout was as total as the original example I once heard, and it was entirely deserved. Dr. Marcus Ellison, already stripped of his license, was charged for forging a medical document and for attempting to administer a drug to a patient he had no right to touch, and what little remained of his reputation and his freedom dissolved. My father, Lawrence Ashford, the man who had spent his whole life worshiping control and reputation, found both destroyed in a single morning. He faced criminal referral for fraud and conspiracy, and the family name he prized above his own daughter became a story whispered at exactly the kind of dinners he used to host. My mother and Spencer, named in the scheme, watched their standing collapse with him. And because the court confirmed me as my daughter's sole guardian, the $18 million trust passed cleanly into the structure my grandfather intended, administered by the one parent who had never once seen Maeve as anything but her child. As for me, I am sitting now in the small, bright nursery that Caleb painted, watching him rock our daughter while the garden he planted glows outside the window. The trust is locked safely away, clean of every grasping hand, waiting quietly to give Maeve a free and unburdened life. I do not hold it as a prize. I hold it as a trust, in the truest sense of the word, the way my grandfather hoped someone finally would, and I no longer flinch when the phone rings, because the people who once made me afraid have no power over me at all. Looking back at that night in my kitchen, at the syringe and my father's hands reaching for my baby, I understand something now that I did not understand at 34 years old. Blood does not make a person family, and a calm voice does not make a person right. The man who fought for me was the husband who ran through the door, and the people who came to protect me were a mentor and an honest doctor, and a judge who would not be fooled, not the father who shared my name. My family thought they could use my exhaustion and my old fear against me, and they forgot the one thing I had spent my whole life learning, which is exactly how the law protects a mother, and exactly how it punishes the people who try to cage one. Now my daughter is safe. The people who tried to make her a bargaining chip have nothing left to bargain with, and the truth, which never needed to shout, simply spoke for itself in a quiet courtroom on a gray morning. But I want to hear from you. Do you think I was right to take my own family to court and expose them completely? Or do you think I went too far? Tell me your honest thoughts in the comments below. And if my story gave you a little strength today, please subscribe and ring the bell to join our community where we share stories of justice every single day.